This lecture will focus on Nixon, Ford, and Carter. So it will focus on pretty much all of the 1970s. The election of 1968. Americans felt that the new left was taking America down a dangerous path. It lacked morality and responsibility. Remember, we're coming off of not just the civil rights of the 1960s and the rise of feminism and all of the other counterculture movements that we looked at, but we're also looking at the new left, SDS and the hippies, and whether or not that they are truly leading the United States into the right place. And so the conservative movement will grow in size and push Nixon into the presidency. He got the support of the moral majority, which were a group of religious conservatives, as well as a group he called the silent majority. Protesters were noisily making the news, but maybe the majority of Americans were silently needing to have some sort of support, and Nixon will fill that void. One of the big cases of the 1970s is Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education. This allowed school districts to bus students to schools to force integration. Remember, we talked about Little Rock 9, we talked about sort of the integration of schools and the integration of public accommodations in the 1960s, but it's going to continue and get bigger during the 1970s. Especially in places like Boston and Detroit, where parents are going to enact massive resistance. They are really going to oppose this forced integration. And so Nixon will announce on the news that he opposes busing. And he'll end up putting 4 conservative justices, including Warren Burger, as Chief Justice in an effort to make it more conservative. However, the Warren Court is an example of not always working, the Burger Court is an example of this not always working in conservatives' favor. Though you end up with conservative judges, judges aren't supposed to rule necessarily in favor of their own political viewpoints, but rather on how they view the Constitution and whether or not this issue can be supported by the Constitution. So the best example of this is, though under the Burger Court it is a more conservative court, you still have Roe v. Wade, which is probably one of the most controversial of all the court cases in sort of the modern time, which was, of course, the right to choice during this time. When we look at Nixon, we have to first look at his foreign policy, which was détente, a lessening of Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union. One of the ways that he tried to do this was through SALT I, which was a strategic arms limitation treaty, a 5-year agreement limiting nuclear arms in each country. Nixon will also be the first president to recognize communist China and visit both China and the Soviet Union. You have to realize, China fell to communism in 1949, and from 1949 until the 1970s, we only recognized nationalist Chinese government that was in exile as the legitimate government of China. So by recognizing that the legitimate government of China is the communist one in actual China, it actually makes a huge difference in lessening Cold War tensions. Also, the Soviet Union feared our lessening of tensions with China, so they were willing to lessen tensions with us. The Soviet Union was also struggling. They really needed our food and supplies. We're going to end up sending $750 million worth of wheat and corn to the Soviet Union. So we're starting to see that the lessening of tensions is also because they need our economic aid, because communism is not necessarily working in the way that they thought it would. In 1972, Nixon is running for re-election, and he goes up against a guy named McGovern. Nixon's successes with foreign affairs, the listing of tensions in China, Soviet Union, and Vietnamization was almost fully in effect. Remember, we will pull the last troops out in 1973. You will see that Nixon is going to win by a landslide. You may not be able to see it, but McGovern is only able to get Massachusetts and D.C. The rest of the world goes to Nixon. But in 1972, Nixon was really concerned that there were people working against him, and so were members of his election committee. And that's what led us into probably the most influential thing of Nixon, and that's Watergate. During the election of 1972, 5 men were arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. They were members of CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President. That is their legitimate acronym. I did not make that up. But it's kind of ironic. Nixon tried to cover up their connection to the White House. However, when 2 reporters from the Washington Post uncovered the story and released it, it was found out that there were members in the White House who knew of the break-in and even approved it, including members of the White House counsel. So there was going to be a special election or special investigation, excuse me, into the Watergate break-in and whether or not the president approved this. During the investigation, it was found out that Spiro Agnew, who's the vice president of the United States, had been accepting bribes and committed tax fraud while he was governor of Maryland. So no, though this was not while he was vice president, this investigation discovered that he actually had committed corruption. And so Spiro Agnew was forced to resign. The 25th Amendment, which hadn't been passed too far before this, dealt with presidential succession. Who would take over if something happened to the president? Okay, so as you guys know, first is president, vice president, speaker of the House, minority leader, majority leader, minority leader, blah, 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 blah. And it goes all the way down until the very last person, the newest member of the House of Representatives. That includes cabinet members. But one of the key parts of the 25th Amendment says that if the vice president dies or resigns, the president is allowed to appoint someone to the vice presidency. And so Nixon is actually going to appoint a representative from Michigan, Gerald Ford. Now, Gerald Ford had spent a number of years in the House of Representatives, and he actually never really wanted to be vice president. He really wanted to be Speaker of the House. He felt that the Speaker of the House was the place that he could create the most change. Well, he will never make it to Speaker of the House. Instead, he's going to find himself in a very different role. So Nixon's going to deny any involvement, but during Senate hearings, one of Nixon's aides said that Nixon knew about the investigation. Also, it was found out that everything in the Oval Office was taped, so the investigation wanted the tapes. Nixon sued, saying that he shouldn't have to give up the tapes, that what was discussed in the tapes was presidential privilege. So you have the Supreme Court case, United States versus Nixon. And in it, they said, no, this does not cover under presidential privilege. You have to release the tapes. This should be public knowledge. And so Nixon was forced to release the tapes. Now, the tapes were missing minutes. There was like 13 minutes that was missing from the tapes. So never on the tapes does he actually admit to the investigation, or not the investigation, the break-in, nor to approving it or anything like that. The problem is that Nixon had denied it, and now with missing evidence, there was no way to sort of correlate that he knew about it or didn't. And so members of Congress came to him and said, look, we're going to impeach you. We're going to impeach you for obstruction of justice, for impeding investigation, all sorts of things. And so then rather than him be impeached for his involvement, Nixon decided to resign. Now remember the previous slide where we talked about the 25th Amendment and how Gerald Ford didn't want to be vice president? He wanted to be Speaker of the House. Well, now, not only has he become vice president because of a resignation, but now Gerald Ford will be president because of a resignation. So Ford becomes the first president and only president never to be elected to that office. Because remember, even though we've had times where presidents have died in office, they are followed by a vice president who was elected into the office of the presidency. Ford was appointed to the job and never sort of rolled into it. So the big things you need to talk about with Ford, and you will see there's only one slide on Ford. There's not much that we sort of need to recognize with him. But the very first thing he's going to do is he's going to pardon Nixon. He really believed that the American people needed to move on from Watergate. They needed to let this go. And actually, as we look back as historians, we realize that Ford was right. The American people were able to sort of move on from Watergate and focus on really the greatest economic crisis in 40 years, a recession. And they were able to focus on other issues and sort of rise up from this tragedy. But at the time, he's going to lose a lot of public support because of it. He's going to increase interest rates to try to respond to some of the issues. And this is going to recreate the worst recession in 40 years. We're also going to start to see an oil crisis evolve. But he's also going to sign the Helsinki Accords, which promise greater cooperation in Europe. He will be followed by Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter will be elected in 1976. So Ford, leaving office, will only have spent about 835 days in the office, being the shortest presidency in the history of the United States. But it was so important in building that bridge between Nixon and the Watergate scandal and sort of continuity in the American presidency. So when Ford comes in 1976, he domestically is dealing with some very, very big issues. We have the OPEC oil crisis, which creates an enormous shortage. We have a horrible, horrible recession that there's no real recovery from. He's going to go on television and ask the American people to, really conserve energy and to stop being so apathetic. And this is called the malaise speech because he pretty much tells people that they're not doing enough, and the American people are like, look, I know you can put on a sweater in the White House and turn down the thermostat to, conserve oil, but we legitimately don't have oil to heat our house. So don't tell us not to be apathetic. We need help. And so he's not going to be as positive with the American people. He is going to have two major foreign policy issues. The first one's the Camp David Accords. Egypt and Israel had been fighting for years over territory, and so Carter negotiated to bring both leaders to Washington, D.C. to settle their dispute. The peace agreement and the end of fighting led to the Nobel Peace Prize for Carter, and this peace has held, okay? Ever since the 1970s, Egypt and Israel have been able to remain at peace because of the agreement created at the Camp David Accords. This should have helped Carter continue to be successful. Unfortunately, in 1979, there was an Iranian revolution where the Ayatollah Khomeini, a Muslim fundamentalist, overthrew the Shah of Iran and, in essence, put into place a theocracy in Iran. We didn't necessarily have a problem with that, but the Shah was someone that we had supported in Iran up until this point. And so when it was found out that the Shah needed to receive cancer treatments, Carter allowed him to enter the United States. In response, the Iranians took the U.S. embassy and held 52 Americans hostage. They wanted the Shah back to Iran in order to investigate him for war crimes, and we refused to release him. We tried to free the hostages with a failed rescue attempt, and in essence, negotiations for their release broke down. And this is really going to hurt Carter. Between the economy and the Iranian hostage situation, Carter will lose re-election in 1980 to Ronald Reagan, and the hostages will actually be released minutes after Reagan's inauguration as president. They literally want to make sure that Carter could not announce that the hostages were being released. So our next, one more slide. Environmentalism. During the 1970s, we have a big focus on the environmental movement. You guys are focusing on this through counterculture, but we do want to make sure that we talk about it real quick. Rachel Carson was author of Silent Spring, which investigated pesticides, and that pesticides were killing birds and fish and poisoning our food. And she's considered the founder of the modern environmental movement. From this movement, we see the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, which regulated air, water, and noise pollution. Okay, we also have Earth Day. Earth Day on April 22nd was created in 1970 in response to this environmental movement. At the same time, we have the 3 Mile Island, which was a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania. There was a limited meltdown, which released a small amount of radiation into air, but fears of nuclear meltdown led to increased nuclear safety regulations and less use of nuclear power. So the nuclear power could be more energy efficient than some of the resources that we were using. Concerns about radiation poisoning led us to sort of move away from it. 3 Mile Island happened before Chernobyl, so then with the meltdown at Chernobyl, there's really an effort to use nuclear power significantly less. So our next lecture will be focusing on sort of this continuation of the conservative movement and the rise of Reagan within the United States.